This episode is brought to you by our friends at Imperial Organic Yeast. The winter seasonal from Imperial is a lager strain that's been a favorite with professional brewers and is now available for us home brewers. L26 Pilgrimage will produce lagers with a very clean profile that can accentuate the flavors and aromas of Pilsner malt along with the aromatics of noble hops. This lager yeast is very versatile and does well for all lager styles from Helles to Doppelbock. Ask your local homebrew store for L26 Pilgrimage from our friends and sponsors at Imperial Organic Yeast. And check them out at imperialyeast.com. That's imperialyeast.com. Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, January 27th, 2022. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. This week, Alex Gruber, who works in technical support for Imperial Organic Yeast, joins us to walk through the fermentation troubleshooting process and answer your questions about yeast and fermentation from social media. If you go to basicbrewing.com, you can find archives for our audio and video shows, and if you go to basicbrewingshop.com, you can find our DVDs and our brewers' logbooks. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Basic Brewing and find our show page on Facebook as well. If you want to support us financially, check out patreon.com/basicbrewing, and thanks to everybody who's helping out in that way. If you go to patreon.com/basicbrewing, you can see a long list of stuff that you can access if you sign up as a supporter. You may remember the final letter in the most recent disaster show was a humdinger. Listener Greg from Portland, Victoria, Australia wrote in to tell of equipment problems, a distracting koala, and a bird that killed itself by crashing into a window. That bird was picked up by one of Greg's dogs and, of course, deposited in the boiling wort. Now, Steve and I debated on whether Greg's story was true, and we came down on Greg's side. We believed it, even though the story sounded literally incredible. Well, Greg sent me an email with photographic evidence to back up his disaster tale. Greg says, I can understand the skepticism around my disaster story, so I've attached my brew log for the day. I've had most of the things involved in my disaster happen before, but this was the first time they've all happened in one brew. It was getting so messy and frustrating that I resorted to writing down the times for each edition, which I normally don't do. I also sat down at the end of the day and jotted down all of the mishaps, with the exception of the bird edition, which was very near flameout. I titled the beer Collab with Dolly in honor of the pointer who dropped the bird in. You can also see how far off my original gravity was as compared to the expected numbers for the AHA recipe and what Beersmith 3 said it would be. Greg says, I've attached some photos which may explain things like, why would a bird fly into the window? My shed has two windows adjacent to each other at the corner. Unfortunately for birds perched on our large gum tree, they can see the neighbor's pond through the two windows and often think it's a clear passage to the water. I've also included a shot of two galahs sitting in our biggest tree and also a shot of what a window looks like after a galah tries to fly through it. It's a bit hard to see, but you can see the wings canted on an angle and the pink and white smudge where the head struck. Thanks for the barbecue rub, and I continue to appreciate your shows and your senses of humor. Well, there you go. I appreciate the. I'm sorry if we doubted you even for a moment there, Greg. We have been proven right to trust Greg's veracity and intentions. And Greg sent me his mailing address because Steve and I are putting together a shipment of Steve's barbecue dry rub to go out to disaster show participants. We're still working on that. I'm still missing two addresses from two of the participants. So if you haven't sent me your mailing address and your letter was read on the show, check your spam inbox for that email that I sent you asking for your address, or you can just send it to me at james@basicbrewing.com. From the email address that you initially sent in the letter. Some very fun news from our friends and sponsors at Groenfell and Havoc Meaderies in Vermont. Ricky the Mead Maker confirms what I hinted at last week. Root of All Evil Maple Edition is now available for a limited time. Root of All Evil is a ginger mead from Havoc. That's one of my favorites. It's really good. I really love the ginger character of that mead. Now, Now, Root of All Evil Maple Edition uses more than 250 pounds of maple-infused ginger from Runamuck Maple in Fairfax, Vermont, in addition to Havoc's custom blend of ginger and fresh lemon. It's a craft mead that's 6.9%, so that makes it deliciously drinkable. Man, that sounds so good. Check out Root of All Evil Maple Edition for a limited time and all of the honey-based deliciousness at family-owned and operated Groenfell.com. That's Groennfell. Okay, you've heard the continuing saga of my stubborn Christmas kettle sour beer. The good news is that things are looking up. It's largely thanks to help and advice from Alex Gruber of Imperial Yeast. Alex Gruber, welcome to Basic Brewing Radio.
Thanks for having me.
You are technical support. Are you the technical support at Imperial Organic Yeast?
So I'm part of our technical support team. There are two of us here who are working on this for the most part, but we have a pretty well-versed customer service team as well.
You are fully 50% of the technical support.
Yep.
So what brings you to Imperial? What's your background?
So, my background is as a brewer. So I've been with Imperial for almost a year now. But before that, I got my bachelor's degree in fermentation science from Oregon State University, and then worked various brewing jobs, both here and abroad. And kind of at the latter end of my brewing career, took a turn towards the microbial aspects of things, particularly in the context of barrel management and wild fermentations. But that drew me into yeast as well and got me talking with people from Imperial and brought me here.
Wow. So did you find yourself harvesting wild yeast and growing your own strains and such?
I never got quite that complex. I have such an admiration for home brewers and people who do that. I never got quite that deep into it. No. Mostly I trusted the professionals to get me what I needed and then manage it from there.
That makes me feel good you said that.
It's a dicey game to start capturing your own yeast.
For sure. I mean, those who do it well, come up with some really delicious results. But I've tried it a little bit myself, and it's hit or miss. So
yeah, it certainly is. Yeah, some of the spontaneous fermentations are really fun, but there's certainly a risk that comes with them.
Now, I got to know you. You and Casey have been holding my hand through this this sour wort process that I started on Christmas Day, and I've been talking about it on the show because I feel that I'm not perfect as a brewer. I make mistakes, and if I only talk about my successes on the show, then I'm doing a disservice to the listeners. Because we're all human and we learn probably more from mistakes than we do our successes sometimes. So you've been nice enough to kind of offer suggestions along the way and to troubleshoot, what's going on with the process. And we were on a Zoom call the other day, and I said, "Boy, I wish I'd been recording this because this is really a fun way to learn how to sort of troubleshoot, the process, to look at each stage of the process to make sure that we're doing things correct." And so I appreciate your coming on to kind of, in a way, reenact that, but then in a way also to help, kind of open the door and provide a view of what goes on in the process. So is what you have been doing with me, is that kind of what you do every day?
It is, yeah. And I think that's something that is really important to highlight, that we put a lot of value in our kind of our troubleshooting or problem solving process, and kind of like you were getting at, really making sure that becomes an educational experience as well, because from my perspective, it's just not going to be that beneficial if we swoop in and tell you what to do and don't talk to you about why, because it could potentially leave you in the same situation. So yeah, that's kind of what I do at from home brewing problems to professional scale fermentations. It's kind of it runs the gamut.
So let me be self-centered here and start with my process.
Sure. Yeah.
I've been talking about it on the show, but it's good to go through it again. On Christmas Day, I brewed a wort with 10 pounds or 4.5 kilograms of American two-row. I collected that wort. I sanitized it. I brought it just up to boiling and chilled to 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 37.8 C. And I pitched W25 Lacto Brevis from Imperial and kept that at 100 degrees Fahrenheit for 48 hours using my high-gravity electric system as a sous vide. And in 48 hours, the pH, according to my little pH meter, was 3.4. So then I took it and put the wort back in the kettle, brought it up to boil, boiled for 15 minutes with 1 ounce or 28 grams of Czech Sats for that whole 15-minute boil, chilled down to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, aerated by shaking, pitched Imperial A01 House, and then that's where we sat for a little while. Usually I say when I pitch Imperial yeast, it's bubbling before bedtime. Well, it was a couple or three bedtimes, and I didn't see any activity, and so I just on my own, and it was over the holidays, and I didn't want to bother you guys, so I hydrated 2 packages of USO5 because that's what I had. And then pitch that into the wort. Again, nothing happened. Added some yeast energizer, nothing happened. Added some oxygen, nothing happened. And that's where I got on with you and I said, give me some more ideas. What's going on? And you had me do a forced fermentation test. So talk to me about what a forced fermentation is and why we need to do it.
Yeah. So a forced fermentation is really it kind of is the starting place for a lot of troubleshooting aspects, just because it's an assessment of the fermentability of your wort, which is important to, when there's a problem going on, to kind of define right off the bat, is this a problem with the fermentability of your wort, or is this a microbial problem? Is there's something going on with your yeast? And so what a forced fermentation is just taking a small sample of your wort that you've just made, preferably putting it in some type of Erlenmeyer flask if you have it, but really any sort of sterile jar works. A mason jar works just fine. Covering that with tin foil to let it breathe, and pitching some yeast in there, generally a little bit of the yeast that you're going to be using for your main fermentation. And then keeping that small sample that you've pulled with some yeast in it at generally about like anywhere from 72 to 78 degrees, and agitating it a couple times a day gently, just to make sure that yeast stays in suspension, and kind of seeing where that gravity gets to, because it'll generally outpace your normal fermentation by a little bit. And you'll get an idea of, in optimal conditions, or optimal conditions from the yeast viewpoint in terms of being able to eat the sugars, what's the terminal gravity of your wort that you made, and realistically what can you expect to get to. So that's kind of it's something that I recommend everybody do, because it lets you get an idea of if something potentially went wrong in your brewing process, or maybe your temperature probe on your mash tun is reading incorrectly, and you happen to be mashing at 165 degrees instead of 152. So yeah, it's a good starting point.
Well, and also I learned something in the conversation with you. I learned something that I did wrong. When I rehydrated those 2 packages of yeast to put into the full batch of wort earlier, I used distilled water because I think, well, I thought, well, it's going to be good because I know that it's a brand new bottle of distilled water. I know that it's going to be sterile, and I pitched it, the packages of yeast into this room temperature distilled water, and I was wrong on 2 counts there.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. It's the rehydration of dried yeast is something that's been studied somewhat exhaustively, but it's strange. The temperature that you actually want to rehydrate it at is as high as it is, about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And then kind of like you were getting at too, the idea of using distilled or deionized water for yeast actually can be detrimental to the health of the yeast, because they end up it puts an osmotic stress on their cell membranes and can kind of lead to some pretty severe declines in viability before you even get started.
See, I learned something.
Yeah, I was excited. It's always exciting to me when someone gets to learn something when I'm talking to them.
And also, you can find something that could possibly be the problem.
Right. Well, particularly for this situation, I was happy to find anything that could potentially be the problem.
Sir, is your printer on? Yes, it is. Can you look to make sure that your printer is on? Is your computer plugged in?
Thankfully, most yeast problems are easier to solve than printing problems. I don't know what to do there.
So I did hydrate this packet of yeast properly to go into about a little over a liter of wort in my Erlenmeyer flask on my stir plate, and after 2 days, it went from 1046 to 1032, which was progress.
Right.
But not a whole lot of progress.
Yeah. It's normally with those type of forced fermentations, if you're keeping them at warm enough temperatures, you should be reaching your terminal gravity really within 48 to 72 hours, as long as there's not an issue going on. And I do think that your situation is a little more complex than a typical one, because it was a kettled sour beer.
Mm-hmm. And so I got a hold of some. So you suggested that I get some Brettanomyces in there and try that. So I got a hold of a packet of. Let's throw everything at it. I got a hold of a packet of W15 Suburban Brett and pitched it in there 3 days ago. And I took a gravity reading this morning of the main wort, and it's at 1038. So it's working. Slowly but surely, it's working.
Right, and that's it's kind of the the emergency ripcord when you add Brett to it, because it's like you were saying, you weren't getting any off flavors in there, and you weren't perceiving anything negative from the wort, which is a good sign to me, but it still wasn't moving, and so in my eyes, it was, well, let's at least turn this into a salvageable product and maybe make something fun with it. So that's where Brett became a solution.
So I've got 800 billion cells in there.
You've got quite a few.
Something's got to happen.
Right. And eventually it's going to turn into something that maybe you can put into a bottle.
And another interesting thing, I took a gravity reading of the forced fermentation flask, and a week after I initially pitched it, now it's at 1022.
Yeah, and I do think it's positive to see that there is progress, but like I was saying, it is a little bit strange to me that it's taking so long to get down, and I do think that the pH of your wort could be playing a role in this, because it is so low after your kettle souring process. But that's also difficult to pinpoint. So,
and also I did an iodine tincture test this morning as well, where I put some of the the hydrometer sample onto a ceramic plate and then dripped a couple of drops of iodine tincture, just because I wanted to make sure that I did have conversion. Because I used to do it all the time, that test after I did a mash, but I've been successful for so long, I was like, it's got to work. So anyway,
Right.
the tincture test, it turned out well. It didn't change to a black color, so there isn't, a bunch of starch in there that's not been converted to sugar. So that was another thing, another tool in the toolkit to try on this thing.
Right. And I think, kind of like you were getting at, a lot of people, especially when they start out home brewing, they're so used to doing those iodine tests. And then after you have a number of successful brews, you'll stop doing that. I think it's pretty similar for professional brewers or home brewers who are using that forced fermentation test. Often you'll do it at the beginning, and then you kind of get some faith in your process and stop doing it. And which is all fun and games until you run into a problem, and then you got to figure out what's going on.
Complacency there's probably a motivational poster with something about complacency being dangerous,
Sure,
with
yeah.
a picture of a mountain or something on it.
Right. Something extremely artistic.
So that's where we are. I have a good feeling about it. I think that I'm just going to let it go, and let the Brett work for, I don't know, a few weeks or whatever, and check in on it again. I was going to throw some passion fruit puree in there, but I'm not going to do that anymore. I
think we might have tried enough things with this.
there's more yeast in there than there is wort at this point, and I just.
I am excited to see where the suburban Brett takes this. That suburban Brett can give off some really nice kind of pie cherry notes as it starts to mature, and I think you'll see over the next few weeks. It seems like it's going to start taking it down once you start getting closer to that terminal gravity. It'll start to put off some really really unique characteristics. I'm a big fan of that strain.
Nice. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And like I say, the wort, I tasted the hydrometer samples from both the flask and the bucket, and they both still tasted good. So, knock wood and, cross fingers and blow out birthday candles or whatever you do to.
Right.
But we seem to be on the right track. Moist January is almost over. That's my version of dry January, where I'm cutting back, but not cutting out my beer consumption. I'm saving my beer calories for the weekend, and I'm very picky about the few beers that I'm enjoying. And thanks to a recent swing through Tulsa, I have some beers from our friends and sponsors Desiree and Dave from High Gravity and Pippin's Tap Room. Now, unless you visit them in Tulsa, you can't get the finished products, but with their excellent kits at highgravitybrew.com, you can brew their taproom tested beers yourself. I'm talking Center of the Universe Midwest IPA, G6 Belgian Blonde, and Doc Brown Imperial Brown Ale, all of which are residing or have resided in my beer fridge. If you want to stick with your own recipes, you can use the very handy Build Your Own Beer page on highgravitybrew.com. And if you want to raise your gear game, of course, you can go to highgravitybrew.com and drool over all the Warthog electric system options and use the code EBC75BB to save $75 off your Warthog purchase. Check it all out at family-owned and operated highgravitybrew.com. That's highgravitybrew.com. So I asked our on the social media, I said that you were coming on the show, and I asked for questions, and as usual, our smart and loyal listeners came up with some really good questions. So are you ready to jump in and tackle what they had to say?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, let's start from Twitter. Homebrew and Vinyl says, what is more important, fermentation temperature, for example, exact temperature for that yeast, or temperature stability, as long as you're not massively over or under the recommended temperature? So how important is it to have just a stable temperature, or is it okay if your temperature fluctuates over the fermentation?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think if you make the assumption that your temperature that you're holding at is within the recommended temperature range for the specific strain you're using, I think that the answer here would be that temperature stability is more important. Sometimes fluctuations in temperature throughout the fermentation can cause yeast to give off a little bit of acetaldehyde sometimes. But I would say as long as you're not talking about large temperature shifts, I mean, 10-degree swings or things like that, you're probably going to be okay. Again, as long as you're within the range that's recommended for the strain that you're using.
And once the fermentation gets vigorously going, does that kind of insulate it against external temperature changes?
Yeah, I think it's important to realize that when you do have an active fermentation, there is a good amount of heat that's being produced by that metabolic activity. Whether or not it's going to insulate it, I think is going to be very dependent on your fermentation vessel and the environment around it. I think it can certainly buffer against some temperature changes. But if you have really warm temperatures, say it's in the middle of summer and you're in a room where it's 85 degrees, I think that I would be pretty concerned about, just the ambient temperature in like helping the overall temperature of the fermentation increase even higher.
Will from Facebook asks, please ask about which fermentation off flavors can be fixed by krausening your fully fermented beer. So I guess we need to start by defining what krausening is, and then, will it help?
Yeah. So krausening is that age-old technique of basically taking a fermenting beer that's generally at maybe 2 days, 1 day, 1.5 days into fermentation, sometimes 3 days, kind of where it gets to its nice. The indication is normally getting that nice yeast crop on sitting on top of the fermentation for top fermenting yeasts. Taking some of that and putting it into a problem fermentation, one that has maybe been not moving as quickly as you'd like, or has stalled altogether. And it's like I said, it's a very age-old technique that's can solve some problems. Certainly, I think sometimes it's treated as more of a Band-Aid than it should be, but it can certainly help.
So what kinds of off flavors? I'm assuming that for instance, if you've got a lager that needs a diacetyl rest, or needs some activity to get rid of some diacetyl off flavors, that might be one candidate.
Yeah, that's definitely the number one candidate that krausening can be pretty effective for is diacetyl cleanup. If you've been using a yeast that's potentially stressed out, or maybe you underpitched at the beginning of your fermentation, but for whatever reason, once your yeast starts to get towards the end of its fermentation where it's needing to clean up that diacetyl and it's just not able to because of its health, that's where krausening can be really helpful in getting some healthy yeast in there that's going to be able to help with that process of cleaning up diacetyl. And the other compound is, I had mentioned acetaldehyde previously with that fermentation temperature swing. Acetaldehyde can also, if you're having a problem with that acetaldehyde, that green apple flavor, sometimes krausening can be helpful in cleaning some of that up.
And we have to mention that diacetyl is the butterscotch or buttery flavor.
Right. Yeah.
In fact, they use diacetyl in making butter-flavored popcorn, don't they?
Right. Yeah, they do. In fact, when I was down at Oregon State, we ran a number of diacetyl sensory tests, and there were a couple of people in the building who were so sensitive to it that they'd have to leave the building whenever this was being
done. Jimmy from Facebook has 3 questions. Are there issues with brewing a small or regular strength 5-gallon batch and then pitching a high gravity beer onto the full yeast cake? I know that's a strategy if you're doing a barley wine, is to or a giant beer, to make sure that you get good fermentation, is to pitch it onto the yeast cake of a previous smaller batch.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some logic there in that first fermentation, assuming it's a relatively low gravity or normal gravity fermentation, and your yeast is nice and healthy at the end of it, you're going to get a good amount of new yeast cell production during that fermentation. And so it'll basically allow you to have a higher pitch rate for that second higher gravity fermentation by pitching onto that yeast cake. And I think that if you make the assumption that the yeast in that yeast cake is healthy and ready to go, I think that can be a great strategy for home brewing.
Now, would there be a potential for some yeast strains to be a little muted in the flavors that they would generate? Say if you had, say a Hefeweizen or yeast strain or something like that, where part of the where, in other words, if you overpitch some yeast strains, maybe they don't give as much of their characteristic flavor as if you pitch a recommended amount or a lower amount. Are there some instances where if you did put a high gravity wort onto a previous yeast cake, would it be detrimental in that way? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. And I think you're getting at a really important thing to remember, which is that, pitching at higher rates can certainly mute your ester profile. I think personally, when it comes to high gravity fermentations, particularly in the world of beer that we live right now, where high gravity fermentations are often in the mid 20s or something like that in terms of Plato, I think that my focus is often more on making sure that is a healthy fermentation and that it completes fully. I think there's certainly the consideration that you could have some more muted flavors if that yeast cake is too much yeast for the beer that you're pitching in there. But I think in terms of a simple solution, I think it's not a bad idea. I think it's better if you're able to quantify more precisely the amount of yeast that you're putting in that high gravity fermentation. But if we're talking from an efficiency perspective, I think that can be a good solution.
Jimmy also asks, if you have a mixed fermentation yeast pack that is older, how does the balance change when building it up into a starter?
Oh, man. Jimmy, if I had a crystal ball, I could maybe give you an answer here. But really, it's going to be very dependent on the mix of strains that are in there. If you really want to get into it, I mean, that could potentially come into the rate at which each individual strain is able to create new cells and potentially shift those population dynamics. It's really hard to say without talking about individual strains.
David asked a question that goes along the same lines. He says, benefits, negatives, or ponderings on mixed yeast strain performance in regards to attenuation and ester production. Will it simply be a mix of the normal outcomes of the two as individuals, or will interactions occur to create something different? I'm not considering the wine yeast additions such as Scott Janisch has researched and trialed, but say two lager yeast strains together.
That's a really interesting question. I would say that by and large, you're going to not really see anything new or different. It's not like blending two colors to make a third color. It's not going to quite work out that same way. I wish it was more exciting than that, but I think that really is the reality of the situation.
Back to Jimmy. When yeast character is a big factor in a style, for example, Belgian beers, Saisons, and Hefeweizens, how do you push esters or push phenols, and is it universal for all strains?
Yeah, so I think it's important to realize that there are some strains that are what we call POF positive, which is POF stands for phenolic off flavor. And these are really going to be the strains that are going to be able to produce those phenols in the first place. In general, though, once you have those strains, they're going to behave similarly to esters in terms of if you increase the temperature, specifically, you're going to get higher production of these phenols. I think when it comes to esters, we kind of touched on pitch rate having an effect on that. You can certainly boost esters by dropping your pitch rate, by potentially increasing your fermentation temperature. There are some other ways to do this as well, but there's always a give and a take. I think when you drop the pitch rate, you have to consider am I getting more esters, but am I putting my fermentation at risk of potentially not fully attenuating? And so it is, there are some strategies, but I think it's important to be looking at the whole picture as well.
Niles also has 3 questions. Assuming the fermenter is well sanitized and there's no contamination, if the yeast used was an older, expired pouch, how long would you wait to call TOYD, or time of yeast death, if it doesn't show any signs of fermentation? And how unsafe is it to then pitch another pouch of yeast? Boy, this is my life right now.
This feels very topical. So I think that to answer the first part of that question, for most yeast strains, and this would probably, I would make the exception to this, some lager yeast strains, but for most yeast strains, if you're not seeing activity within 48 hours, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's time to call the TOYD, or the time of yeast death, as Niles put it. But it does certainly indicate that there could be a problem going on. As far as the risk or how unsafe it is to pitch another pouch of yeast, it's certainly not unsafe. What I would probably recommend doing, though, is like we had discussed earlier, is this would be a good time to, if you have not ran a forced fermentation, this would be a pretty ideal time to assess the fermentability of the wort that you have.
Before you throw more money and cells
right.
into the
right. Safety isn't really the issue. It's more of an economics issue.
But is there a risk of, say, the dead cells or the old cells from the previous pouch, autolyzing or causing some off flavors in that?
Yeah, I think that's certainly something worth considering. I think it's important to understand that autolysis flavors take a little while to develop, and unless there's something incredibly stressful about what's going on in that wort, whether it's an extraordinarily low pH, or in the event where you do get a beer that ferments out, if it's a particularly high alcohol beer, those are going to be things that are going to speed up the process of potentially of those autolysis flavors coming out. But in a wort that's just stuck, that isn't fermenting, it's not something I would be worried about right off the bat. Again, if you pitch a second pouch of yeast and still don't see any activity, it starts to become a pretty serious question of what's going on in your wort.
Back in my day, Alex, when I first started brewing, the common knowledge was that as soon as primary fermentation is done, get your beer off of that yeast, because it's going to start to die and cause autolysis and all these rubber bandy flavors, and you got to rack to a secondary fermenter just as soon as you can. Of course, we now know that's not true. So how long, generally speaking, if it's a healthy fermentation, how long, can you leave your beer sitting on yeast before it actually does start to taste bad because of dead yeast?
And that's a great question. I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying about being dependent on the amount of alcohol that you have in there, or some other potential stressful factors. I wish I had a nice timeline to give to you, but I think the thing that I'd really recommend is trust your own sensory analysis for those type of things. I mean, if you're concerned about it, I'd say get it off the yeast if you're able to. I mean, if there's no real reason that you're leaving it on there, other than maybe you just don't have the time to rack the beer, there's no real benefit for most situations that you're going to get from leaving it on there.
Let's take a quick break to talk about our friends and sponsors at Tavour. Tavour is a way to select delicious craft beers that you may not be able to find in your area and have them delivered to you. It's not a Beer of the Month club where someone chooses beer for you. You only pay for the beer that you choose over the course of the month. Signing up for Tavour is free. Just create an account at Tavour.com. That's T-A-V as in Victor, O-U-R.com. And download their iPhone or Android app. You'll receive notifications for 2 new beers each day that are available for purchase with in-depth tasting notes from Philip at Tavour. This month, look for delicious IPAs from Cushwa Brewing Company, a couple of barrel-aged stouts from White Elm Brewing Company that are inspired by the Mexican hot chocolate beverage champurrado, and even some tasty seltzers from Smooge that Ella from Tavour says are really popular on the app. If you're not interested in the beers or the seltzers that you see, no worries. Just skip the ones that you don't want. However, when you see something you do want, don't wait. Just click on it to add it to your crate. Your beer arrives fresh every few weeks, allowing you enough time to fill a box and pay the least shipping. Why don't you check it out? It doesn't cost anything to sign up, and there's no obligation to purchase anything. In fact, if I can ask you a favor, go to Tavour.com. That's T-A-V as in Victor, O-U-R.com, or download the app, and when you sign up, enter the promo code Basic Brewing. That's all one word, and you'll get $10 off your first shipment of $25 or more. Again, it's free to sign up, and there's no obligation to purchase. Sign up at Tavour.com or with the Tavour app and enter Basic Brewing as the promo code. Niles asks, can you please explain how yeast loses viability over time? Like, how does some cells keep living while others die? And if you had a not too old expired pouch, would the dead cells produce the autolysis off flavor automatically, or can the living cells keep that from coming out in the finished beer?
I'll address the first part of that question first, and I'll do it poorly because I don't have a great answer for it.
It's almost philosophical.
It is. I think it, it's really, it's kind of asking, you have to start thinking about yeast cells as being as diverse as even our human population. Some people are older, some are younger, some are in better health, some are in worse health. And I think that you need to realize that if you're looking at yeast at a cellular level, at individual cells, you have to think about them like that as well. And potentially an individual yeast cell has a cell membrane that is not as well maintained as another cell. And so it may be more susceptible to some potential stresses within the fermentation. So I think that's kind of the best answer I can give for the first part of that question.
It's a crapshoot.
It's a great question. I think someone more well-versed in this subject than I could probably give you a better answer, but that's where I'm going to go.
So if you have an old packet of yeast, is it going to taste nasty because of the autolysis in there, or if you just go ahead and make a starter, is that going to negate any of that?
Well, I think that's tricky because you have to realize that if you're going to make a starter with that, all of those dead yeast cells are still going to be present in that starter, and you could be reducing the percent of the population that they make up of all the yeast cells that are in there, but they're still going to be in there. So I think that if you're concerned about a pouch being old enough that you're worried about just starting off with some autolysis flavors, I'd probably just get a new pouch. I know that's probably not the answer that Niles wants to hear, but I think if you're starting out with that risk, you're probably not starting in the best spot.
Jeff, along those lines, Jeff asks, maybe out of scope for the topic, but if you find the time, quote, in your non-legal binding opinion, how long does a pack of yeast last? I've asked customer support a couple times about this, and they usually say if it's not too much older than 4 months, you should be fine. What is too much older? I guess we should say that the recommended shelf life, the stated recommended shelf life from Imperial is 4 months.
That is correct. I would certainly back up customer service here with their recommendations and that question of what is too much older. Again, kind of going back to it, if you're concerned about your yeast being too old from the start, it might be best practice just to get a new package. But I'm smart enough to say that I'm going to go with customer service on this.
Now, I can't remember. I had a packet of yeast, of Imperial yeast, that was like 8 months old recently, and I made a starter, and the beer came out just fine. So, you can be successful in that. But in talking to Casey offline, and this let me know if I'm talking out of school or whatever, but she said that some yeast strains have a longer shelf life than others, but 4 months is kind of like the number that they've settled on to, sort of guarantee the performance of like all of the collection.
Right. Yeah, that is absolutely true. There are some strains that certainly don't do as well with storage as others. And I think that the reason I would hesitate to say, how much older is too much older is really because there's so many factors that come into play. Like Casey was mentioning, the strain of yeast itself, the kind of type of yeast that it is going to be very important, but also really every aspect of how that yeast was handled in that 4-month period since it's been packaged is going to play into how well that yeast is going to be doing at that 4-month mark. And it's difficult to just plug in the variables and come up with a solid answer for that. And so often I think that's why I lean towards the side of just being on the safe side and going with a new yeast pitch.
One final question from Niles. Can yeasts breed in the sense of two different yeasts making a new yeast offspring?
Yeah, so this is a great question. Actually, this is what Dr. Matt Winans runs our research and development department here. What he works on is yeast hybridization. And yeast normally in brewing scenarios, no, it doesn't breed. It replicates. And so it's a different process, and it's actually quite difficult to get yeast to make a new offspring or to breed. But that's why Matt Winans is a doctor, and that's why he runs our research and development department. So he's doing some really cool work with that, and that's something we're looking into.
So I want to thank everybody who wrote in questions. They were excellent questions. But I want to ask you, Alex, what do you recommend for success? I mean, what are your factors that you think will most influence fermentations that we've got to keep our eye on the most?
Well, that's a great and high pressure question. I think it comes down to making sure that your yeast is healthy to start with, that you're getting good yeast, and then understanding the role that pitch rates play in your fermentation, as we kind of were touching on in terms of controlling ester profile and having healthy fermentations. These are things that yeast pitch rate for your fermentation is going to play a large role in, but just in general, making sure that your yeast is healthy when it starts is going to be a huge step in making sure that your fermentation behaves well. And then personally, I really think that you can't understate the importance of data tracking. So really paying attention to your fermentation, both visually, but certainly if you're able to take gravity readings throughout the fermentation, if you're able to do that in a sanitary way, because it's really important not just to have the starting and the terminal gravity, but understand what's happening throughout that process. And James, it sounds like you have a pH meter. For those of your listeners who have a pH meter, it's great to track pH throughout the fermentation as well. It can offer some really important insights about what's going on in terms of yeast health and the general health of your fermentation.
Even though I calibrated my pH meter, I'm not, I don't know. I need another pH meter to check my current pH meter to see. Because, one of the questions that we asked is, are you sure that's the pH of the?
Right.
Have good tools. Yeah. And calibrate them when you can. And keeping track of your data, like with a logbook, like what we sell, is a good thing to have. And that way also that, the more that you do track your data, the more that you learn about the process and the more that you can kind of figure out or, get a heads up or a red flag or whatever metaphor you want to use, that something may be going amiss.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're spot on there. That's really the educational aspect of it. Is it can't be overstated. If you're able to look back and learn from your previous fermentations, that's really big. And then, I mean, selfishly, from my perspective, if you give us a call, it makes it a lot easier to figure out what's going on if you've written down your fermentation data.
Yeah, are you guys available for help from us lowly homebrewers if we do have a problem? If you're not the host of a show,
yeah, absolutely. So you can reach out to us at our customer service line. We field questions in many ways, shapes, and forms. But we're always happy to try to get your fermentation back on track if you're having an issue, or even if you're just having questions. That's what I'm here for.
And we find that information on imperialyeast.com?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, on our website, you can get in touch with us and submit questions. That way, I believe we have some social media things that I'm not well versed in, but you can ask questions through there as well. Yeah. Well,
excellent. If you treat everybody as nice as you've treated me, then it's a resource that is extremely valuable, and I appreciate again I appreciate yours and Casey holding my hand throughout this whole thing and being so patient, and I appreciate your asking answering the questions today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a pleasure to chat with you, and really, it's something that we take pride in terms of helping people out. So I hate to break it to you, but you're not special in this aspect.
Thanks a lot, Alex.
As much as I enjoyed the process, it's, we do realize it's important for everybody, and it's something we really like to do.
Thanks again to Alex and to Casey, as always, at Imperial. The Brett is doing its magic, slowly but surely, on that stubborn sour wort. I'm really looking forward to tasting the final results. It tastes good so far. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com, and please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Check out our mobile-friendly shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody supporting us through our Patreon page. Special goodies coming your way. Check that out at patreon.com/basicbrewing. It's all until next time. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. In the meantime, stay well and stay tuned. So long.